Here we go with the Khan Academy on anemia of iron deficiency versus anemia of
Talk about
chronic
some of the
disease.
differences between anemia of chronic disease and iron deficiency anemia, because really these two diseases present very similarly. Both of them are going to have patients that present with signs and symptoms of anemia. So patients that are chronically fatigued and feeling weak, looking paler than usual, and maybe experiencing some shortness of breath. And really, when you go to draw the basic anemia labs, take a look at what's going on in the blood, you'll see that both of them are microcytic anemias. So really, the only way to tell these two diseases apart is to draw iron studies. So let's take a look at what some of those values would show. So here are some of the values that you get back when you draw iron studies. And we already went through this for iron deficiency anemia, but let's just do it again for practice sake. So with iron deficiency anemia, you'd expect your serum iron to be decreased, right? Hence the iron deficiency part of it all. The percent saturation, or the percentage of total binding sites on the transferrin molecules that are actually occupied by iron, would also be decreased. The total iron binding capacity in iron deficiency anemia is increased. And we said that that was the body's compensatory mechanism to deal with the deficiency in iron. So what the body does to deal with the shortage of iron is increase its production of transferrin molecules. It makes more transferrins, puts it out into the blood so that the transferrin can go out there and bind to more iron, to find more iron and bind to more of it. Okay. And ferritin, which is reflective of the amount of iron that's in storage in the body, is decreased in iron deficiency. Okay, so those are the values for iron deficiency anemia. Let's compare that with what you see in anemia of chronic disease. So just as an overview, once again, anemia of chronic disease is a disease where you have some underlying inflammatory condition. And as a result of it, you have an increased production of a molecule called hepcidin. And what hepcidin does is it, number one, decreases the absorption of iron from the gut. And it also decreases the recycling of iron from the breakdown of red blood cells. So really what your body is trying to accomplish in this disease is it's trying to limit how much iron is coming into the body. And at the same time, it's trying to tuck away as much iron as possible into storage so that very little is present in the blood. In essence, the body is trying to play keep away with the iron away from bacteria and inflammatory cells because they really need it to thrive and to grow. Okay, so you'd expect that the serum iron in anemia of chronic disease would be decreased. That's exactly what the body's trying to accomplish. It wants very little iron present in the blood. The percent saturation, which is again the percentage of transferrin binding sites that are actually filled up with iron, would also be decreased. The total iron binding capacity, or the amount of transferrin that's in the blood in anemia of chronic disease, is decreased. And again, this makes sense. It goes totally in line with what the body's trying to accomplish. It decreases the production of transferrin so that there's less transferrin out there in the blood trying to bind to iron. Okay. And finally, the ferritin, or which is reflective of the total amount of iron in storage in the body in anemia of chronic disease, is characteristically increased. And this is because, once again, the body has tucked away as much iron as possible into storage, okay, which is reflective of what you see with ferritin. So really, there are a couple of differences between iron deficiency anemia and anemia of chronic disease. Firstly, iron deficiency anemia is really a disease of total body depletion of iron. And these lab values reflect that very well, especially the ferritin. This tells you that there is no iron in the body, not even in storage, not in the blood, not in the storage, not anywhere. Anemia of chronic disease, however, isn't necessarily a disease where you have a depletion in iron. Instead, you'll see an increase in ferritin. So that tells you that there's iron in the body. It's just tucked away from the access of bacteria and inflammatory cells. Now, also, another difference between these two diseases is that in iron deficiency anemia, the body is doing its absolute best to increase the amount of iron available in the serum. And you see that with the total iron binding capacity. It increases the production of transferrin. It does its best to try to bring more iron into the body and into the blood. However, in anemia of chronic disease, the body is trying to accomplish the exact opposite. It's decreasing its production of transferrin so that you have as little iron as possible in the serum. And the increased ferritin also reflects that the body is trying to hide away its iron in storage. So
I'm gonna stop it right there. Just to correct a couple things she said. Inflammatory cells don't eat iron. Okay. This should be properly called anemia of chronic infection. And you know that's our thesis here, you know, about chronic infections play such a major role. You don't have to fear them. Like I was just telling Dr. Dallas Hack this morning when I was chatting with him. 750 tests I've run on H. pylori, and no one's negative. No one has zero. Okay, we all have a little bit, so you shouldn't fear it. But we want to measure it, and we want to measure whether it's active or not. That's the difference. We all have it. We all have a little Epstein-Barr. We all probably have a little chlamydia pneumoniae, things like that. So it's not about fearing it. It's about determining whether it's active or not. Iron deficiency anemia is almost always, and Dr. Carter can certainly shut me down on this comment, but it's almost always an absorption issue. You know, very few people do not have enough iron coming into their system, and there are probably a couple minor genetic conditions. I don't know about hemochromatosis, how that really sets up iron levels, but usually if you're iron deficient, it's an absorption. And I spent a lot of time writing this book, Michael, showing, you know, trying to find research on how you can have deficiencies in certain micronutrients like iron, like B12, like you know, things of that. And the research out there is very poor. So that's why we always just say, don't take a single probiotic, expand your microbiome with great diversity.
Right.
And then, Michael, you want to make a comment on that?
So in summary, those are some of the differences.
Oops. We don't need your summary, Gal.
No, that was perfect. Go ahead.
That was well done, I thought, that video. Yeah. And I'm going to play one that's, you know, it's really interesting because I tried to find one on red blood cell distribution with because they didn't have one on that. This Khan Academy is missing a very important marker that should be column 5 in this list, and that's a red blood cell distribution width, because that also gives you a very good clue. And I spent a fair amount of time this morning trying to find a decent video that's understandable, intelligible, and talks about red blood cell distribution width in this context. And I found 0. Okay, but I'll play one I did find. You know, it didn't pass certain criteria of. I find this one more humorous than anything, and I'm starting it right in the middle here, rather than start at the beginning. But so, you know, size variations. It's called anicytosis, so no same cell condition. So in other words, all, you know, it's just a fancy, you know, I guess Latin word or something for that. Normal red blood cell diameter 7 microns, and a normal red blood cell distribution width is not 11.5 to 14.5. If you're healthy, it's 11 to 12.5. Anything above that, you have some inflammation. But I just want to show how the red blood cell distribution width can change with iron deficiency anemia, just so we have that kind of piece of it. So you can tell based on your RDW whether you're anemia of chronic infection or anemia of, what did we say, of iron deficiency.
You see?
I have to stop and tell you guys about Lecturia.
I prepared this thing all this time, and I got bonked by an ad. I got bonked by future breast health. Let's see. There we go. Sorry about that brief interlude.
So we continue our talk about hematology, and
you know what I mean? This guy's
increase in the cells are of different diameters. The RDW is high. There is increase in the distribution of widths. You see? So the normal RBC diameter equals around 7 micrometer. The normal RDW is a percentage of the variation, and it's normally between 11.5 and 14.5%. it's only significant if elevated. So if we measure the RDW and its normal range, it's insignificant. It didn't tell me anything. But if it's elevated, that's crucial. That's of importance. So when the RBCs are of the same size, the RDW is normal. When they are of different size, i.e. the variation is big, that's increased RDW. What's the name of the condition? Anisocytosis. So to understand why cells vary in size, especially in anemia, we have to discuss it. Okay, so this is the bone marrow, and the bone marrow is producing cells that are of normal size or normal diameter, i.e. normocytic RBCs. Okay, that's fine. Let's say now that I am deficient in iron. I am not getting enough iron, and there is iron deficiency, which will cause iron deficiency anemia, but it will happen gradually. So first, bone marrow still have kind of enough iron, so will produce normal cells. Then the iron will decrease, okay? So cells will get smaller because I don't have enough iron. I'm making RBCs big enough kind of to make my iron equal for that production. So it's okay. Then they're getting...
I've had enough of this character, but the idea is normal cyclic anemia. A normal cyclic cells pretty much produce the same size. Now, red blood cells hang around for 100 to 120 days. So over time, they actually can enlarge a little bit. And that's the inflammatory component. We talked about this probably 4 or 5 months ago. We went over this. But when you're iron deficient, you'll get these smaller red blood cells. So that's where the difference in size between this and this is substantial. And so your red blood cell distribution width will expand quite greatly. Rather than 11 to 12.5, then you have the inflammatory zone. I'll show you.
smaller.
I'll show you the chart. But then you have an anemia zone as well. So what we have here for all you iron junkies is, and I know it's not that large, but what we have is author and date. We can get rid of that. This is sort of my crib sheet where I make all my charts on this Keynote program, but basically what we have is a low zone, and there's really, no real explanation what the problem with a low RDW is. It's probably just not very common. I don't think it's necessarily harmful. That's why I don't have it in any particular color other than black. It's just considered low, or maybe it just is not, it just doesn't occur. It's kind of like a softball, it's a certain size. It's never the size of a baseball. Then we have an optimal zone between 11, 12 and a half. Then we have an inflammatory zone between 12 and a half and 16. And then we have the anemia, iron deficiency anemia zone, where your red blood cells really explode in size. And so you just have to realize that even though I indicate that inflammation overlaps with that, if it's 16, 18, or 20, you definitely have an iron deficiency issue. And the inflammatory zone is probably just here, but you probably can get some overlap between the two. So that's kind of that. But the point is, when iron is low, ferritin is low, iron binding is high, and iron saturation is low, that's anemia of iron deficiency. And then the RDW will be also very high. So that's just another piece of it. And I'll come back to this chart in a bit. But, Dr. Carter and I wrote this book, Cancer is an Infectious Disease. And I've been in this space for a long time. But going through this book, and I wrote this for Jonathan Lansman, so Dr. Series will be on end of August. But going through this, I pulled up some of the cancer lab patients that had cancer, and looked at some of the things some of the counts they had. And here's one, patient one survived 11.4 white blood cell counts, and then the patient that died, 54,000 white blood cell count. Okay, he died. Okay, but when we look at this, looking at the iron, okay, the man who died, he had a 3,300 ferritin and a 160 for the iron value. Now his iron wasn't super low, so it really wasn't necessarily, it's kind of hard. Obviously, it's anemia of chronic infection because he has cancer, it's an infectious disease. But what I then started looking at is the ferritin to iron ratio, and his was 21. Now the lady with, see, this guy had very slowly matriculating cancer. He was much older, way down the curve. And it's kind of like a slowly generating prostate cancer where you're not super sick. Whereas this lady had a very aggressive form. And you can see her iron level was substantially suppressed and her ferritin level was quite high. Her ferritin to iron ratio was 86. How is that hyperlinked? But extraordinarily high. Now here's me during COVID, during the height of COVID, my fever was 103.5. My iron value, so I have an infection. I have anemia of chronic infection. My iron value was 14 and my ferritin was 1,300, 1,400. But the ferritin iron ratio is 97. Now, what's interesting about these three, and I only have an N of 3, a cohort of 3, so we can't make all kinds of conclusions. But I was much more acutely sick than the lady, and she was much more acutely sick than the man. And you can see how the ferritin to iron ratio not only tells you have anemia of chronic inflammation, chronic infections, you have a chronic infection. It was kind of a barometer of how severe it was. So I thought that was very interesting. Yet, my white blood cell counts weren't crazy. Let's see if I can find them. So this is why, multiple tests are really critical. And so I can't even remember what my white blood cell counts were, but I'm gonna be like that LifeLock guy. You can look at every lab I have, no big deal. So so my anemia of chronic inflammation was off the charts, okay? But my white blood cell counts were, Michael, you wanna hear what my white blood cell counts were at the height of COVID?
What was it?
4,700.
Yeah.
So this is an exercise in, if you're not testing, you're guessing. And if you test very narrowly, you missed it.
Right.
How can I have a fever of 103.5? I had no meds. I was just like sick of the dog, dragged myself to LabCorp. And my white blood cell counts are 4,700. Yet my iron value is 14. That's why I was so tired. Ferritin, 1,300. So we need it. We can't just run lipid panels and A1C. I think that's the point. I was shocked. I totally forgot what my white blood cell counts are. 4,700 is normal. It's normal.
But your lymphocytes had to be low, though.
Well, let's take a look at that, Dr. Carter. Let's take a look at the lymphocytes. Glad you brought that up, and then we'll go back into it. My lymphocytes were low, Michael.
Yeah.
And my neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio was, 6. Not super high, but see, that's why the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, balancing out the white blood cells, is so critical. And I bet you there's a pretty strong correlation between this and that. So, I always like to bring my mentor, Dr. Tremp, into the scene. And, what he told me, he was a French Canadian. And so this book, I highly recommend you attend the Jonathan Landsman docuseries, and you'll get this book free of charge. Okay, and then Dr. Carter and I put a fair amount of work into it. So it's 85 pages on 8.5 by 11, but I wouldn't say it's a manifesto document on this, but I think it's worth reading. And it's not one of these 35-page premium for a a docuseries kind of thing. I put a lot of effort and pulled a lot of different information into it. Like this, you're not getting information like the ferritin iron ratio and having that revealed in the run-of-the-mill book. But what Dr. Tremp said to me when he introduced me to anemia of chronic infection, it's anemia of chronic disease, anemia of chronic inflammation, or anemia of chronic infection. They all mean the exact same thing. So, iron is a key component for hundreds of proteins and enzymes that support essential biological functions, such as oxygen transport, energy production, DNA synthesis, hemoglobin, so on and so forth. Because the body excretes very little iron metabolism is tightly regulated. It's interesting, Michael, what's that molecule that helps you shed iron when you haven't, so you don't, it's not the transferrin, it was something else.
It helps you shed it?
Yeah, it's when you have anemia of chronic inflammation, it was in the talk. I'll have to remember, but literally.
Oh, asparagus?
Transferrin, but there was another.
I think
hepcidin.
Hepcidin, yes.
Yeah. See, what that does is that helps you stop absorbing it, and then you sequester it in ferritin. So you're getting rid of the iron, free iron, available iron, two different ways. But I've told this story before that how that iron supports microbial growth is Georges Banks, the richest fishing grounds in the world. The St. Lawrence River drains out there, and Sorel, Canada, where Dr. Tremp grew up, and then the Iron Range out in Minnesota dump a lot of iron into that part of the North Atlantic. And the sunlight catalyzes the growth of algae in the presence of iron. And then the organisms thrive on the iron. So that's the richest fishing grounds in the world. So that's a sort of a macroscopic explanation of what anemia of chronic disease is, where the iron will catalyze the growth of bacteria and probably viruses as well. I mean, they just said bacteria, but I'm sure it goes across the whole range of things. So we had this little chart here, and now, so where do you want to be? That is the $64,000 question. So I spent a fair amount of time today losing what I want to show you, and we found it again. Thank goodness. So I have a fairly complicated chart here. Okay. And I just looked at different ranges of normal for iron and ferritin. And so a low on iron is around 40, a low on ferritin is around 40. You can be lower and not be anemic, but that's sort of an upper end of a lower range where you don't want to be too low. And so that gives you a ratio of 1. And then you can have an iron of 160 and kind of the high on ferritin. McCullough says 100, I say 120 based on my research. So that gives you a ratio of about 0.75. So on the high ferritin, low iron range, low iron would be 40 on the low end of normal, and ferritin of 120 on the high end. That gives you a ferritin to iron ratio of 3. And on the low ferritin, high iron side, you have a 160 for iron and 40 for ferritin. So it's 40 divided by 160 is 0.25. Really, a ferritin to iron, if all you baseball fans out there looking at batting averages, you want to be between 0.25 and 3. And I call that ferritin to iron acceptable. But ferritin to iron optimal is going to be around 0.6 plus or minus, a couple tenths. That's where you want to be. And then, just looking at our cancer patient with iron of 40 and a ferritin of 3,500, their ferritin to iron ratio, 86. We want it to be 0.6, 86. Now I'll just get into one other point, which is kind of a research tool, but sometimes you need to express these things in ways that aren't crazy. So for example, if you look at just looking at these things linearly, you don't want to be way down here in the orange. The green is a very narrow band of optimal. Then you have this huge inflammatory segment. And so like, where's optimal? It's this little teeny spot, okay? And that's why a lot of times in nature, everything's log linear. So when you express this exact same thing as log base 10, then it's a much more easy to chart out and see where you are in terms of true optimal levels. So from a log perspective, you want your iron to be at minus 0.22, whereas the cancer patient rather than being 86 is 1.93. And so when you convert it to logs, you can see, you know, it's much easier to manage the data. That's all I'm pointing out. And but you got to be aware of this, because sometimes the statistics will be expressed in this fashion when they want to, from a log linear perspective, and sometimes they show the data as linear. It's another little biostatistician trick that they apply. But with that, we have finished in record time. And when I announced this on Sunday before the 4th, I figured 4th of July, we may not have a lot of people on vacation, but I didn't want to go too in depth on topics today. And I think that covering that. Now we still have a very strange looking, who's this, Andrew? Who am I seeing on that screen? Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for coming in. So let's see. Hepcidin, thank you. Thank you, Wayne. Hepcidin, thank you, everybody. By the way, you have a really nice homocysteine level of 7.6. Yes, I do, Dr. Stark. That's because I have a good microbiome. I absorb my B vitamins very well. It's not just about methylating, it's absorbing them as well. The spike protein causes inflammation. You know, it's hard to say. I mean, it's a virus too, right? I mean, Michael, do we want to talk about the difference between the spike and the virus that harbors the spike? No.
Well, actually, it's well, the virus, of course, has more, you know, epitopes, you know, protein receptors and so forth components, whereas the vaccine really only has the spike protein as its protein component, shall we say. And but they both obviously cause inflammation in the body. And of course, because the shot is causing the body to produce the spike protein in overtime, and we really don't know if this is being turned off at all in individuals. Obviously, there's a whole gamut of symptomatology out there, but of course, having the exposure to just the virus and then the body fights it, the body's not going to be producing it anymore, right? Whereas the shot is more of a continuous type thing. So far worse in terms of causing inflammation.
Right. There was a good question about units of measure. Now this is nanograms per milliliter for the iron and the ferritin, so there will be different units of measure, but the ratio should stay the same, as long as the same unit measure between the tests. You just couldn't cross a US or an English versus a metric or EU measurement across those two markers, then do the ratio. So Wayne asks, is iron deficiency anemia often associated with iron excess in the cells, as hepcidin traps the iron inside the cells, or does high intracellular iron then lead to poor ATP production, fatigue, and cancer? I think iron deficiency anemia is deficiency everywhere. And that's why you do the UIBC and the transferrin and the other iron binding capacity and things like that. So if you look at me, I was sort of ectopic because I was low in iron binding capacity and UIBC as well. UIBC is iron binding capacity, but iron saturation, I was low in everything. So it was almost like a cross between iron deficiency because my iron was so low and anemia of chronic infection. So, you know, it's not impossible for those to kind of cross over because ultimately you're extremely iron deficient. I don't know, Dr. Carter, if that's reasonable. What about SCD40L as an inflammatory marker? Would you use that as well? That's not in my vocabulary.
Not familiar with that one. What is it?
I'll look it up right now. But see, you know, it's always about what's practical for population. So it's a cytokine, persistently higher serum, CD40 ligand, and the soluble form CD40L are members of the tumor necrosis factor family. So we do TNF alpha occasionally, but see, I'm not sure what the cost of that is, but you know, compared to C-reactive protein, tumor necrosis factor alpha is 10 times more expensive. So, you know, you always balance in the value you get something versus the cost, unless you
Right. Yeah.
just want to see everything. Darn units, my ratio is 11 gulp. Yeah, see, well, you know, the point I didn't make, which was an important point, is nobody has, and I'll bring the screen back here. Nobody has anemia of chronic inflammation or not. Okay, it is a continuum. Okay, and so there's an optimal level because we always have pathogens, as we've discussed at the very beginning. So it's just a question of degree. I mean, your gums bleed a little bit. Do they only bleed when you floss? Do they bleed a lot? Do they not bleed at all? You know, do you not floss? That's a continuum. It's all about a continuum. So 11, you know, it's a lot of people carry extra iron. And I don't have a great explanation for that. But now I know how I can get them to dump the iron. We'll infect them. Yeah. But, you know, it's challenging to, I have a lot of people that can't give blood because of a positive COVID test or any number of circumstances. So how do you?
Well, they can have it as a therapeutic draw. It's just, you can't just go to the Red Cross and donate. So it has to be a physician order. So, and they just throw it away.
So Michael, you could order.
Yeah, of course.
Therapeutic draw. Really good point, because I have a lot of people. I didn't think of that. That's so obvious and so makes so much sense. So
yeah, especially those with hemochromatosis and so forth.
Yep.
Huge amounts of iron. They can't donate that blood. So, and most of the time they have to go in every 8 weeks or so to get that drawn off. So
anybody, in my opinion, anybody over 200, maybe donate once a year. If you're over 500, probably twice a year. And the second you dump blood, I'm thinking about donating blood, but it's a long recovery path because I'm just like, I don't want to give up my performance. 3 weeks to recover if you're doing high end kind of stuff. But you will, your ferritin will pop right out. It'll just, it's much faster than burning fat. It's there, you give blood, and the ferritin comes down. Is that your experience?
And men, should always at least try to do it once a year, because unlike women, well, of course, premenopausal women, they get rid of their iron, through menstrual periods. But of course, once that menopause occurs, then it's just as problematic as men in terms of iron storage.
Well, if you want to look better on your ferritin to iron ratio, convert it to the log scale. Of course, that doesn't do anything, but let's see where we are on oops, pardon me, I just closed my session. So let's go look at the chat, and then maybe everybody gets relief tonight and gets to go home early. Can you reduce ferritin quercetin?
Well, ferritin, when you're talking about it being inflammatory, quercetin is anti-inflammatory. Curcumin is also anti-inflammatory. Whole host of supplements can be beneficial there. So, but if it's also because of iron storage as well, then it's not going to have as much of an effect. Again, because it's storing that amount of iron there. So then that's when you have to, again, donate blood to get that lowered. But from the inflammatory piece of that, sure.
So Scott says he has hemochromatosis and he has to give blood 3 times per year. Where's the iron coming from in that condition?
I mean, if you're a meat eater, red meat has tons of iron in it,
Right.
But if you use, iron cookware, it can come in that form. But it's also in various, vegetables and so forth as well, but more higher concentration, of course, in meat.
Steve, I think I do have the ferritin iron ratio because see, this is I didn't put units of measure on the linear here because I kind of put these bars out as sort of from a log perspective just to show that. But this would be 0.25 to 3, and then of course anything below 0 in the log scale is less than 1. So.
Yeah, but mine is, I think, minus 0.666. Rather odd number, but
Yours is minus 0.666?
yeah.
I thought Andrew's would be minus 0.666.
That is spooky.
I worked in media PA, but I never went to media PA, and I had the business manager there gave me the extension 666 because she was very Pennsylvania centric, and I came to Pennsylvania once a quarter, but she was angry with me that she gave me 666. So yeah. So did you say 0.666?
Yes.
Yeah, you couldn't be much closer to optimal because this is 0.6 right here.
No, negative 0.6. That's what I'm saying. Your chart there doesn't have anything below 1 on the ratio.
No, negative 0.6. This is -1. So negative 0.6 is out here someplace.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I see it. Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, okay, 0.6.
0.6.
Oh, yeah. So this is negative 0.22 right there, Steve. That's
Really? Oh.
Yeah, that's the log of ferritin to iron. When I want your ratio on a regular scale to be 0.6, just dividing your ferritin by your iron at 0.6, then the log is minus 0.22. So that's that. So you're out here someplace right along this edge of optimal. What's your actual number? I can't do the log. I can't do the reverse log in my head.
What's the what number?
What's your number without the log?
Negative 0.6.
Oh, wait a minute. No, that's not possible because they're whole numbers.
Ferritin, iron.
Huh.
It's the ferritin divided by the iron.
Yeah. My ferritin, let's see, is 190 and 160. So whatever,
If ferritin's 90 and the other one's 60, then you're, 1.33.
and then it's the other way. It's the other way then.
But that's going to be positive. It's still a positive number.
All right. I'll have to check that again.
You divided by 90, so it's going to be, 2/3. So
Okay. I'll check that again.
just take the negative sign out. And now you're really Andrew.
The only way it turns negative, right, is when you take the logarithmic scale.
Right.
It's never going to be negative otherwise.
Interesting.
Let's see what else we have. Lack of iron causes lack of ferritin. Absolutely. If you're not absorbing well, you're going to see your See, that's what the initial talk was about. When you don't have an inflammatory or infectious process, if you're just deficient at absorbing iron, then your ferritin is going to show up low. Your body's going to do everything it can to keep the iron somewhat normal, but the ferritin will be low.
Right.
Okay, so that would be the other extreme where we might be seeing, less than 0.25 on that end of the scale. Calcium improves uptake of iron too. I don't know, but I take your word for it, Melissa. I mean, there's a lot of cofactors to absorption, and
Right.
flour products are fortified with iron. Yep, we know that. We don't need it. I actually just got on here late and missed the program. I had labs done just the other day. Iron is 60 and ferritin is 120. 120 is the upper end of normal for the ferritin, and the iron is 60 is a little, it's a skosh low. You'd be considered normal. Okay, but I think an iron of 60 is just a skosh low, really. I mean, what I like to think is, closer to 1 is better. Like ferritin's 100, iron's 100, kind of thing. But that's why I have here on the ferritin to iron optimal, iron 100, ferritin 60 or so. That way you're not sequestering any per se, you're just sort of in balance with everything you're doing. Hopefully that makes sense. I listened to Dr. Shankara Chetty today. I heard about him. Said the spike causes some people to have an allergic reaction. I saw that he treats them with steroids and antihistamines to alleviate the allergy. I know people are getting both antihistamines and steroids when they have severe COVID. Michael, any comments on that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Hey, Jim, close the door.
it's a huge protocol now to address this. And again, a lot of people are more predisposed to, mast cell activation, which is excessive histamine release. So not that it would work in everybody, but again, there's the whole gamut of symptoms, and of course, everyone has their own underlying disease syndromes, aberrant labs, and all of these different things. So certainly worth a try, but I wouldn't say that it would, be 100% in everyone to affect that.
The question was about transferrin. I don't run that test very often, but I did run through that in the algorithm for optimal a long time ago. And I'm looking to see if I can find that number for you, but it's a good chance I don't have it in front of me right now. I'm afraid I don't, but I did do the analysis where transferrin shows a range where it doesn't affect mortality when they do their best to isolate it, but I don't have that data in front of me. Albert, good question though. It's just one of those things where when you have the basic iron panels that LabCorp Quest runs, the UIBC and the iron saturation, the ferritin, the red blood cell distribution, the free iron, it's another marker that definitely will bring more confirmation to the table, but it's not going to necessarily change your diagnosis or approach. But it's a very valuable marker, no question about it. So let's go. Dr. Lewis said the standard range for the ratio is optimal, however. No, acceptable, Dr. Stark. And the optimal, your ratio of 2 in range. Yeah. Okay, you got it. It was just a typo. Do you recommend taking iron pills? Any side effects? I don't know when you'd ever take an iron pill. And number one, you're taking a pill and you're probably not absorbing well, so you're not breaking down that pill well. It's like, before you go to that extreme, unless it's an emergency situation where your iron was ridiculously low, like mine was, fix digestion. It's most likely the reason if you're
right.
deficient.
Yeah, I mean, if you H. pylori and low stomach acid, that'll knock out your ability to absorb iron well.
And nobody has enjoyed taking an iron pill, what I can tell.
Yeah, it causes constipation and so forth.
Constipation and some people nausea. So,
But you know, probably the better way, if in fact you are anemic, you know, from iron deficiency, you know, if you like organ meat, liver is full of iron.
yeah.
So,
You know, Martha, the question that for your regular doctor is everyone that was mentioned on that Khan Academy video. I put the link there, but you want your iron saturate, you want iron, free iron, you want ferritin, you want iron binding capacity, and you want iron saturation at a minimum. But transferrin and a red blood cell distribution rate. But transferrin would be a good one. And I don't know about the hepcidin. I don't know if that's allowed.
I haven't measured that.
Yeah. The ferritin iron ratio is 3.9. Is this in the category to donate blood? So what is your actual ferritin? Because see, if your iron, you got to look at them individually too. I mean, the ratio is really important to understand where you are in that sort of inflammation infection continuum. But you know, you're at ferritin at 188, you're not really a candidate for donation. You know, if you're on the edge, and if you did, it would be, I wouldn't donate a full pint at that.
Well, also you got to look at what the hemoglobin hematocrit is as well, because
Right.
Yeah, that's very key.
Right. And
Because below certain levels, they won't allow you to, but below certain hemoglobin levels and weight, they won't allow you to donate blood.
And the answer is on replayed. I'm just backlogged on creating these videos because I'm finishing up this book. I'm actually coming close to finishing it off. But let's take a look at the sick puppies MCH and where'd it go? So when I had that serious problem, my MCH and MCHC and MCV, all the volumes were absolutely normal. So that's the thing. I think I really haven't done research on these parameters for the regular iron parameters.
Yeah, but those are just indicative. If they're low in general, you have a microcytic anemia,
Yeah.
you know, and if it's high, it's a macrocytic, meaning that you're generally deficient in, you know, B12, folate, vitamin C in some cases. So those values are very important when it comes to looking at what you actually are absorbing from an iron and nutrient standpoint.
So to answer your question on getting labs, you want a CBC with differential, but here's what Dr. Carter's talking about: hemoglobin, hematocrit, MCV, MCH, MCHC. Very, very, very common test. And then the RDW. I was shocked that my RDW and the height of that thing was completely normal. So I have some good markers. So very lower than that one. But anyway, I just killed my screen again. Apologize for that. You see anything on your side? But let's see. We have one last question, and then we'll call it an even. Vitamin D increases uptake of iron. That question, Martha. Will be hepcidin is not an available test unless in research labs. Makes sense. Do the chronic infections that you focus on cause anemia of chronic disease? They almost all do. They almost all do. But the problem is the one that that Dr. Carter and I focus on the most are not acute. It's really the acute infections that ramp up these the ferritin to iron ratio substantially. That's why I wanted to show the ratio and the log, because it kind of amplifies the signal when you look at the ratio rather than looking at them individually. And knowing that I can see just a few research papers on it, but it's very paucity of data on this. So I think it's important to look at. But I think the reason why I'm excited about it is because we need another strong tool, an amplified signal, if you will, to look at the chronic phase, the chronic type infections. Like Lyme can go acute to chronic. You know, Epstein-Barr can be in the background and you think you have nothing, but your white blood cells are 3,700. You think that's somewhat normal, but it's really not. We need to now look at this iron to ferritin to iron ratio, because as I talked about at the beginning is we all have something. It's a question of whether it's affecting our physiology. And this iron, you know, between the white blood cell count, the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio particularly, and now this ferritin to iron ratio, we might get a little better picture of what's going on with these sort of subacute, Dr. Carter calls them these subacute infections. So hopefully that answered your question. Because at the end of the day, we want to know the answer to that question, Albert. We want to know, because this is an area that's often slept off as unimportant. My Oura ring tells me that my deep sleep and REM sleep are good, and I feel pretty falling off. Keep the day progress. And that's the only change I've made.
This is Al.
Yes.
I have another. So, like, and your iron dropped to ridiculous low levels. I'm assuming the hemoglobin doesn't drop very quick. The hemoglobin being the one that causes anemia would take a long time of an infection to be dropping, and the iron level might just drop down real fast and then come back up as you're getting better. Is that a way to look?
You know, it's tied to the red blood cells, life and times of red blood cells at around for 120 days. So that's going to be an average, whereas the iron and ferritin can change much more instantaneously. So I think that's a fair statement.
Thank you.
That's the big challenge. You know, very little appreciation for the concept of half-life. How long does something stay? If it's elevated, how long does it stay elevated? You know, C-reactive protein versus fibrinogen versus some of these other markers have very different half-lives. And, you know, A1C is a look back at your glucose over 4 months. So the half-life is substantially much longer. So you're asking a great question. And so the only thing we have to go by is the half-life of the type of cell that it's tied to. So, and then from experience, knowing that iron can probably change somewhat instantaneously. I think with infection, that iron number can plummet very quickly with a real serious infection. So that's sort of an instantaneous marker. Ferritin probably fairly quick, maybe not quite as instantaneous as iron, but I'm speaking out of school because who's doing the test, you know, every half hour kind of thing, drawing blood. So those are tough tests to do, but I think that's a fair statement. But at the end of the day, you want to look at the sort of the constellation of things anyway. You got to look at the constellation. And the reason why you look at multiple labs is my white blood cell count's normal. My neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, not normal. My ferritin iron ratio, extraordinarily not normal. My red blood cell distribution width, completely normal. You know, so it's a story being told out there. And if we look, you know, with through blinders, we're going to miss an important piece of that story that can impact the health. So that's, you know, that's where I am on that. So there's no perfect marker. And someone earlier said, is the ferritin to iron ratio better than SED rate? No. Is the SED rate better than the iron to ferritin to iron ratio? I don't know. You know, my favorite test remains the SED rate, then the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, fasting insulin. But ferritin to iron is going to become somewhere in the top 5. I know it. So anyway, there we go. Everybody have a great evening. Dr. Harshfield, you're not on to give our final remarks. Yes, he is. Hallelujah. Otherwise, it's broken.
Can you hear me, guys?
I hear you, but don't see you.
Oh,
There we can.
okay.
We can see you.
Well, I am infatuated with nanoparticles, and ferritin is another one. It's smaller than an exosome, and it's hollow like a red blood cell, but its protein to iron ratio is like 200 times more efficient than a red blood cell.
Wait a minute, say that again. You got to say that last statement one more time.
Okay. The iron to protein ratio in a ferritin molecule, it's a little hollow, little 20 nanometer size little dude, is 200 times that of the hemoglobin in a red blood cell. So red blood cells are smart. They have no nucleus. They're just, and no mitochondria. They're just Kawasaki, pirates. What is ferritin doing? And hemosiderin is a brethren of that. That is another protein that carries iron. And if we get hemosiderosis, it's okay. It's not as bad as hemochromatosis where you absorb too much iron. So all these little nanoparticles that we talk about are so powerful and so important. And iron is a very important little creature because when it moves, it creates an electromagnetic field. And it's really interesting, Thomas, how the ferritin ratio, the liver makes a bunch of ferritin to hide the iron because something's going on in the body that wants that iron, and your body's going, you know what? We're just going to take this out into space, and it's going to float around the bloodstream or interstitial space. We're not going to let you see that. And cancer loves iron and can't find it. I mean, we need a cartoon of all these little characters and how all these things happen when the cancer molecule is looking for the iron and the ferritin's made by the liver and it's hiding it away. I mean, this is just so awesome how it happens. And like you said, these things, the half-life of these things is nothing. Although seconds and minutes are forever for these particles.
You know, Coleco, they're trying to, all those guys from Google want to live forever. And they invested $3 billion into this genomics company. And something as simple as this, David, is it even on their radar? No.
It's just another biomarker in the bloodstream. And the RGCC folks from Switzerland do a liquid biopsy. You send 20 cc's, 220 cc syringes of your blood to Switzerland, and they'll tell you what your body's talking about. And the conversation, what your liver, your brain, all that conversation is in your bloodstream and readable by these folks. It's really pretty phenomenal, Thomas. And this ferritin molecule, yeah, key.
You know, but my point is, who is studying half-life, physiological half-lives? That's
no one. You're
no
right.
one is studying physiological half-life. So we're just looking at these. We're dynamic. To Albert's point, great point, Albert. We are dynamic, and all our data is completely looked at as static.
It's kind of, you take a little blood draw, and for one moment in time, you know exactly where that human being is. In a few minutes to hours, to certainly days later, they're in a totally
it's kind of looking at things like a flat piece of paper versus a three-dimensional object. That's where we are in terms of labs. And then what you get is your lipids and your A1C. And that's what you're getting out in the real world, in the insurance-based world. They don't even understand the concept of half-life. I don't think most doctors could answer the simple question you had, Albert, about the time domain of these things, on how the variation. That was an extremely astute question. But you know, we've in all my books I've published it's very hard to find, but find the half-life of some of these cytokines. And I know C-reactive protein, I know fibrinogen, I know haptoglobin. There's only a few that, and you know, RDW by inference of its life. There's very few things that we actually know the half-life, how long they hang out for. So when they measure it, where are they? Are they relaxing? Are they on the way up? Are they steady state? That's why you've got to retest. The only way we have to know is you periodically retest, and then we can do trend analysis. But it's still looking at two static points. So, and Martha, to answer your question, don't panic about cancer. Cancer is just one of many subacute chronic infectious diseases. So any number of conditions can lead to anemia of chronic infection. Cancer is one of them. But I think in particular, I think cancer has, if you have a sustained high ferritin to iron ratio, there's more risk of cancer, I think. This is strictly from just small subset of labs I looked at in people, so I don't know for sure. So just take that with a grain of salt. But anyway, David, thank you so much for bringing in the molecular view. And Dr. Carter, thank you for all you contributed today. And I really think I think anybody who has a ferritin, let's say 300 or over, you probably should set up an appointment if you can't donate blood to have Dr. Carter still some point. And with that, everybody have a great evening.
Thanks, guys.
Great week. Thank you, Thomas.
All right, bye for now.
All right.